So chat, I'm a little late to the party on this one. This is something that apparently was news about 4 days ago at the time of this recording. But this was a Supreme Court decision. There was a law that was passed in Tennessee that banned gender affirming care. I believe it was specifically for minors, if I remember correctly. Correct me wrong if I'm wrong about that, chat. But I believe that was the case. And so this ban was challenged in the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the conclusion the Supreme Court came to is not the conclusion that a lot of us on the left would agree with. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. We'll give our thoughts as we go along. So here we go.
The Supreme Court upheld a Tennessee law today that restricts access to gender-affirming care for transgender minors. The High Court ruled 6-3 on the decision. The law, known as SB 1, prohibits healthcare providers from administering hormone therapy or puberty blockers for any transgender individual under the age of 18. But the plaintiffs argued the law discriminates against transgender people because it denies them certain medical treatments.
See, and I would agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. These are, we just talked about moments ago, we talked about, the Trump administration cutting funding to the suicide hotline that was specifically for LGBTQ plus youth, a very important life-saving service for LGBTQ plus youth. And one of my biggest criticisms of a lot of conservatives that are in favor of these things is these people will constantly go on and on about how they just want to protect kids. They want to make sure kids are safe. And then they'll take away these valuable resources that are literally life-saving for kids. And this is another one of those things. I understand that not everybody gets it. Okay, not everybody has a trans kid. Not everybody has, a trans relative or a trans friend in their life. Not everybody, is plugged into online LGBTQ plus spaces. So they don't really understand a lot of these issues. And I get that. I don't expect everyone to get it. But at the end of the day, when you've got countless examples of medical institutions, medical research that's conducted, mental health experts that are commenting on these things and they're saying, hey, this issue is an important issue, and access to gender affirming care for trans individuals, whether they're underage or not, is literally a life-saving thing. That is important that we focus on these things and we listen to the advice of the professionals. And one thing that's a very common thing when it comes to conservative lawmakers is they don't give a fuck about what the professionals have to say. There is facts and evidence and research that proves that specifically in this issue, in regards to transgender youth, gender affirming care saves lives, period. Like, it absolutely does. It helps, trans youth deal with gender dysphoria, which is something that, again, I understand a lot of people don't get it, but it's a very distressing condition. And the proven method of treating gender dysphoria is gender affirming care. And also, conservatives will be really dishonest about what constitutes gender affirming care for minors. The common thing you'll hear is that they're mutilating the genitals of children. And that is not true. That is absolutely not true. Maybe we'll get into this as we go on in the segment a little bit longer. Maybe I'll kind of summarize what gender affirming care for underage individuals actually look like. Because if you would listen to conservatives, they'll tell you they're chopping up the genitals of kids. And it's not true. There was a clip that I showed a while back where during his campaign, Donald Trump was talking about kids were going to school and they were getting their genitals mutilated at school, and they were coming back a boy would go to school and come back as a girl. That's not happening. It's insane to me that people will believe this. Let me get something into your heads real quick about that particular allegation about schools transing the kids and performing gender surgeries on kids in school. Schools lack so much funding, they can't even update their textbooks half the fucking time. You think that they have enough money to provide surgeries to kids that cost tens of thousands of dollars? Absolutely not. The fact that any idiot believes that is insane to me. We're constantly complaining about how underfunded schools are, how they can't afford to renovate their buildings, how they can't have the latest technology resources that they need access to, how their textbooks are out of date, how teachers are underpaid. But you expect me to believe that schools are performing gender surgeries on children that for adults, most adults in the trans community can't afford them because they cost tens of thousands of dollars. If you've ever been in online trans spaces, there's a common thing you'll see with a lot of trans people in online communities. It's very common for them to share GoFundMe's to cover the costs of their, gender affirming care in the form of surgeries and stuff like that, because they're so expensive that most of these people can't afford them, unfortunately. So what makes you think a school has the funding to pay for this shit for a kid? It's ridiculous. Anyway, I'm kind of getting lost in the weeds here.
CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins us now. Jessica is also a Loyola Law School professor. Jessica, great to see you again. What was behind the majority's decision to side with Tennessee?
So the majority looked at this law and tried to figure out what were the categorizations that it made here and
what made them side with that decision. Well, maybe it's the fact that there's a heavy slant in the Supreme Court that leans Republican. Like, they have the majority in the Supreme Court. That's one. And then when it comes to any Democrats that may have voted in favor of it, Democrats have decided in their stupid fucking heads that progressive issues are losing issues. So they've decided to abandon their own voter base to pander to right-wingers. That's probably why.
What it decided is that the law made categorizations based on age and medical use, not based on sex and transgender status. And because the majority concluded this is a law that discriminates essentially on the basis of age and medical use, they were going to use the lowest level of scrutiny, something called rational basis. And the government essentially has.
But there's nothing rational about this. There's nothing rational about this at all. You literally have medical experts saying that, yes, gender affirming care, including for minors, is a life-saving treatment for transgender youth. Like, the experts are saying this. So the rational decision in this case would be to say, oh, the experts say that this is the right course of action for transgender use. Okay, we're going to agree with the experts. But that's not what they're doing. So there's nothing fucking rational about this decision that they're making whatsoever. It's ridiculous.
Has to prove the least in order for the court to uphold the law. And that's what happened here. It wasn't a particularly heavy burden for the government.
Jessica, what does this decision say about how the court views transgender rights?
Good question.
So I didn't hear the first part of the question. I apologize. But to the extent that this tells.
Oh, Tipster, you don't know the medical experts are LGBTQ plus brainwashers who are full of fake news. Oh no, I know all the narratives. You know, I've had conversations like this on social media with multiple people who are on the anti-trans side of things, and I've heard all these arguments before. I am fully aware, and it's so funny to me that these people would just outright like ignore the science. These people like to convince you that they're rational thinkers, and they're clearly not. Because like I said, obviously the rational decision would be to go with what the medical experts have to say. But that's not what they do. They go with like, oh, I believe that this, stupid shit violates my, the stupid take they have is like, oh, it's usually a religious thing. Oh, this just, it goes against my religion, so I can't allow that. Or, oh, it doesn't feel right. I don't understand it, so therefore it's wrong. And it's just like, well, maybe if you took the time to actually educate yourself on it, and you took the time to understand what we're talking about here, then maybe you'd feel a little bit different. And who knows, maybe you wouldn't. But at the end of the day, I could at least have respect for someone who actually takes the time to at least look into it. But no, a lot of these people, they just believe right-wing propaganda. And it's just like, oh, they're mutilating the genitals of kids. They're grooming children. Well, that's bad, and I don't want that. So yeah, I'm gonna vote against that.
Tells us about transgender rights. I think that actually The majority here went to pains to say this case is not about transgender rights.
But it is, though. It absolutely fucking is. You're taking a portion of the trans community and you are stripping them of their access to healthcare that is life-saving for them. How is this not an issue of transgender rights? What the fuck?
That in fact, this case is about age. It's about who can use certain medicine, but that whether or not you're transgender actually makes.
You know what doesn't make sense about that either? Because they're claiming, oh, it's just about age and our concerns about age and certain types of medicines or whatever. What's insane to me is, like, specifically when you focus on the issue of puberty blockers and like transgender kids using puberty blockers, all right? They have an issue with trans kids using puberty blockers. Oh, because they're dangerous. It's basically, a medication that's used for chemical castration and stuff like that. All these stupid arguments they'll use. Oh, it's dangerous. We shouldn't allow kids to have access to that. What about kids who, I forget the name of the condition. What is the name of the condition? Let me Google it real quick in a separate browser. You have premature puberty. What's the medical name of that condition? Precocious puberty. So if you have premature puberty, you're dealing with a condition called precocious puberty. Okay? And this is a condition that, on the surface, it seems like it's really not that big of a deal. Oh, a kid went through puberty a little sooner than normal. Like, that's no big deal. But there are serious health conditions that can materialize as a result of precocious puberty. Let me see if I could find some of those, actually, real quick. What are some of the negative health effects of precocious puberty? Precocious puberty or early puberty can lead to several negative health effects, including reduced adult height, increased risk of metabolic disorders, and cardiovascular disease, and psychosocial challenges. Those are just some examples. There's a long list of other issues that you can run into as well, but that's just from an initial search. So there are genuine negative health repercussions that someone could suffer if they experience precocious puberty. Now, what is the treatment, chat? Can anybody in the chat guess what would be the treatment for someone experiencing precocious puberty? I'm wondering if anyone, any single soul in the chat, can guess what treatment a doctor might administer to an underage patient who is experiencing precocious puberty to prevent them from dealing with any of those negative health effects. Boom, Fennec the Rabbit in the chat said it. Puberty blockers. So conservatives out there, explain to me why it's safe and okay to use puberty blockers to treat precocious puberty, but suddenly it's an extremely dangerous, drug to use when it's in relation to transgender kids. It doesn't fucking make sense at all. Just on that basis alone, it doesn't make sense. Let's continue.
Makes no difference in the court's opinion, in the sense that transgender people who do not identify as transgender, everybody is prohibited from using this medication for these purposes.
So they're actually outlawing the use of puberty blockers even for cisgender kids. So basically, let me run that back. I want to make sure I understand that correctly.
Whether or not you're transgender actually makes no difference in the court's opinion, in the sense that transgender people who do not identify as transgender, everybody is prohibited from using this medication for these purposes.
What? So wait a minute. Something like puberty blockers, for example, they're outlawing them for everyone who's underage. So if you have precocious puberty, a doctor in the state of Tennessee would not be able to administer you puberty blockers to prevent any potential, negative health effects you could suffer as a result of precocious puberty. So think about that for a second. If you happen to be a conservative who's watching this, think about that for a second. There is life-saving medication that if you have a cisgender kid who's dealing with something like precocious puberty, your doctor can legally not prescribe them that medication that will help them with that condition now because they're cisgender, because simply because they're underage, even if they're cisgender. So now, even if you're a conservative who doesn't give a fuck about the rights of trans kids, now your kids are potentially affected by this as well. Unfucking real. Talk about a self-own.
And so the court there was not a majority to break any new ground on how we treat laws that burden people on the basis of transgender status.
So
By the way, I just want to, before we continue with this video, because I did say that I would kind of summarize it. I'm going to summarize it as best as I possibly can, because again, so much of like what conservatives will tell you about gender affirming care for minors is they're chopping up the genitals of children, and it's just not fucking true. If you want a summary of like what, being a transgender teenager or what a transgender kid is like in terms of receiving care, let's say you're someone who comes out as trans at like a very young age. We're talking like preteen age or even like slightly before that, okay? What does it look like to be a pre-teenaged child, pre-puberty child who comes out as transgender? Typically what that entails is, the kid will express in some way, shape, or form to their parents that, I don't feel like, if somebody that's born male, I don't feel like a boy, I feel like a girl. Or, I'm a boy, but I like to wear dresses and I like to, play with girls' toys and stuff like that. However it happens, because obviously kids, they don't communicate the way that, adults communicate. They'll have their own way of communicating it to their parents. So typically what that looks like is, you might take your kid to therapy so you can kind of understand what they're dealing with a little bit more. You might, try and see like, hey, kid, is it, because again, a lot of these parents, they don't understand, right? So is there something wrong with my kid, or, is there some kind of confusion or something like that? So did you take the kid to therapy to better understand what's going on? And, if the kid actually is transgender, then it's a case of like the therapist will tell you, okay, it looks like this is a transgender kid. They might be suffering from something like gender dysphoria or something like that. Here's what we would suggest. We would suggest something called social transition. So what is social transition, chat? I know it just sounds like a complicated term. What does it mean? All social transition means is letting the kid dress differently. If they're a boy, if they're born male and they identify as a girl, let them dress like a girl. Let them style their hair like a girl. Let them play with girls' toys if that's what they want to do. Like whatever, the social norms have constructed means like this is a girl. These are the things a girl does. If your child wants to do those things, let them. If your child wants to use a feminine name, let them. Let them choose your name. Maybe you guys can choose a name together, and they identify under like a feminine name, or they start to use feminine pronouns. That's it. Okay? We're talking about therapy and social transition. No chopping of genitals. No injecting of hormones into like prepubescent children or anything like that. That's not what's happening. When conservatives tell you that that's what's happening, that's a fucking lie. Okay, so social transition. Now what happens when you approach the age of puberty? Now, puberty can have a lot of negative effects, developmental effects on a child that's transgender that may increase the level of gender dysphoria that they experience. Okay, so under the supervision of a doctor, your doctor may say, hey, we think that puberty blockers are a good option for your child. Puberty blockers are totally reversible. So if something happens where the kid decides, hey, you know what? I don't feel trans anymore. I feel like the gender that I was born as. You can stop the puberty blockers. Puberty will resume as it would have anyway, and they'll just continue to live life perfectly fine. Now, like any drug, there are side effects of potential side effects that are part of using puberty blockers. We take that risk with every medication we use, even if you take something like over-the-counter fucking Tylenol. Okay, there are side effects you could potentially experience with any drug. So I'm not going to pretend like that's not the case. There are. But the majority of people who use puberty blockers, if they're using them to, delay puberty, and somewhere down the line they decide, I'm not trans anymore, I'm perfectly fine just identifying the gender I was born as, you stop the puberty blockers and everything just continues biological business as usual. But if they are still trans, at the end of it, and they start reaching the age of what we call medical consent, that's typically the age of 16. It varies based on state or whatever. But for most teenagers, the age of medical consent is 16 years of age. Once they reach that age, again, under the supervision of their parents and their doctor, then the doctor may suggest, now it's time to upgrade to, hormone replacement therapy. And then it's administered under the supervision of the parents and the doctor. When you start talking about surgeries, no one's talking about things like bottom surgery until the age of 18. So if you hear any conservative talking about minors getting their genitals chopped off, they're literally fucking lying to you. They're literally lying to you. Now, can you potentially find one-off cases that happened here or there? Yeah, you probably could. But the majority of people who are advocating for the rights of trans people, including trans youth, when it comes to this topic, what they're advocating for is social transition for the really young kids. When it comes to the age of puberty, the use of puberty blockers, if it's authorized under the supervision of a parent and the doctor. And then when they reach the age of medical consent, then they can consent to the use of HRT. After that, 18 years old, that's the cutoff for surgery. That's what people are advocating for. When you talk to the majority of trans activists, that's what they're advocating for when it comes to the rights of trans youth. But anyway, I would like to add that trans-related medical have the lowest regret rate, lower. Yeah, exactly. This is a true fact that you can look up and verify yourself. A lot of conservatives will go on and on about how much there's, detransitioners are a thing, and, trans people that transition, they regret their decision, and, like this is a ongoing problem that's so prevalent, and it's a big issue. It's just not true. Literally, as Fennec the Rabbit in the chat said, the amount of people who regret medical transition is lower than the amount of people who regret knee replacement surgery. And let's just get a basis for that, just a basic summary of that. What percentage of people regret knee replacement surgery? Which, by the way, I gotta admit, like, my knees have been bad. I'm probably gonna have to get knee replacement surgery at some point, and hopefully I'm not one of the people who regret it. So the percentage of people who get it, this is just a quick search. It says less than 20% of people regret it. And keep in mind, the percentage of people in the trans community is very, very small. It's insane to me that they get so worked up about a lot of this shit and make it like a bigger issue than it is. When you're considering the global population of people, less than 2% of the entire global population is trans. And an even smaller percentage of that are trans kids. So it's so bizarre to me that they will make the biggest stink about this issue when it's not that big of a sample size or a group of people at all. It's literally not. It's same thing with like the trans sports issue, right? That's a whole nother issue. So I'm not going to like get too much into it right now. I used to be admittedly kind of on the fence on the trans sports issue because I hadn't really had the time to like look into it. Like when I started first covering politics on my streams, some of you guys who've been around for a while, you might remember whenever the topic of trans sports came up, I was like, I'm really not educated on that issue yet, so I'm not comfortable giving a stance just yet. Kind of on the fence right now. But now that I've had the time to look into it, just kind of on a basis, I think a lot of the people who make a big deal about the trans sports issue, they don't understand the effects that HRT has on like a trans woman, for example. When you're transitioning from male to female, like they don't understand the effects that has on the human body. And when you have sports that permit transgender participants in their sports, these are people who are knowledgeable of those effects on the human body. And as a result of that, they've established rules in place to level the playing field. Okay. Like they've considered these things and they've made rules. Like a common one, for example, is I don't know what sport specifically this is associated with. I don't recall off the top of my head. So my apologies for this. But basically, like one of the common things they'll do is like, oh, for this particular sport, we've decided that you have to be on HRT for a minimum of 2 years before you can participate in the sport. Why? Because it's been scientifically shown that for that amount of time, the effects on your body would make it a level and fair playing field with other participants within your gender. And that's kind of like where I stand on it. Okay, if the experts have decided that these are the rules that are appropriate for this particular sport, then I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of like trans people being able to participate under these guidelines. And I think that that's a fair position to have. Oh, Tipser, the trans sports issue gets even worse. One of the people pushing for the ban of trans athletes only did it because she swam 0.02 seconds slower than the trans individual. Well, there's a situation involving a trans teenager here in Southern California that there's a lot of conservatives like making an uproar about. They like lied and claimed that like, oh, she's unbeatable. She hasn't been beaten by anyone. And she's just dominating all the biological women in the sport. And it's just like, you actually look at her record and she's lost plenty of, I think that she's is she a racer? Like a sprint runner or something like that? I don't recall. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of, this is an off the cuff conversation. I think if I did like an in-depth like discussion on it, I might be able to bring up some of the resources so I'd know for sure. But I think they're like a sprinter or something like that. And like if you actually look up their competitive record, they've lost plenty of times. They don't win every race that they compete in. And even the event that a lot of conservatives were calling them out for, it wasn't even like a competitive event. It was a qualifying event or something like that. And even in that exact event, they had lost some of their races. It's like fucking insane. But anyway, we're really getting in the weeds here, so let's continue.
Does this decision create a different argument over what rights parents have regarding their children?
It does. There's a separate discussion here to be had about the rights of.
Like previously, my position before I had the chance to like actually research the topic myself. Previously, my position on the issue of like trans women in sports, which it's a kind of odd that they never have any concern about trans men in sports. That's kind of weird, right? It's only the trans women for some reason. But in any case, my previous position before I had the time to look into it was I don't know what the answer is. It seems like a complex issue, but I don't think the answer is excluding trans people. So I just needed the time to like look into it and kind of like see what the science is behind it and stuff like that. And essentially the science is like, there are effects of HRT on the human body that in the terms of trans women, it reduces like bone density and it reduces muscle density. And there's things that over time using HRT, it would essentially level the playing field between somebody who was born male and somebody who is female, right? So if the science says for a particular sport, let's say, for example, basketball, okay? And I don't remember the exact numbers. You can look them up, obviously. But let's say in basketball, between the medical experts that are knowledgeable of, the effects of HRT on the human body, and then like the athletic people who are knowledgeable of like the sport and what it takes to be a fair competitor and whatnot, if those two bodies have come together and decided, okay, 2 years on HRT levels the playing field enough where we're comfortable letting a trans competitor compete in our sport. And if that's what those two bodies coming together have established, then I'm like, okay, that seems fair. Absolutely fair, right? Because you don't want somebody, who just transitioned and, still has a lot of the characteristics of, somebody who's born male competing in the sport and, yeah, having an unfair advantage. You don't want that to happen, right? So if the rules are established that you have to take HRT for at least 2 years before you can compete, I think that's fair. I think that that's totally fair and that should be the way to go. but that's just my kind of position on it now that I've had the time to look into it. I dropped a study about trans surgery regret rates in the politics in the Discord server. Let me take a look at that. So again, like just to kind of elaborate on that, as we discussed before, the rate of regret is less than with knee surgery. So what is this? Does this just have like a percentage number somewhere? So pooled relevance. Okay, so what I'm seeing here, it says the pooled prevalence of regret after gender affirming surgery was 1%. 1%? That's it? Am I reading this right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Fennec. But like I just kind of skimmed through the article, and that's what stands out to me. The pooled prevalence of regret after gender affirming surgery was 1%. So knee surgery was what? It was 20 to 30, I think it was. Let me bring that back up actually. What is the regret rate for knee replacement? Oh, let me instead of rate, let me put percentage. Percentage. Why does it? Okay, now it's giving me a different result. Okay, it was. Oh, there we go. 20 to 30%. 20 to 30% for knee surgery. And according to this article, if I'm reading it correctly, let me look at my chat real quick to see if I'm not misreading it. I did the math and it's 0.009. So they probably rounded up a smidge. But just to be fair, in like what it says there, according to them, it's about 1%. So let's just round it up to give a little bit of wiggle room. 1% regret rate. So it's not even just less than knee replacement surgery, it's significantly less than knee replacement surgery. That's nuts.
Of parents to direct the medical care of their children. And that's actually under a different part of the.
And that's ultimately what this is. I think that's like, I think that's the best compromise you can come up with, you know, because when you're dealing with like parents making medical decisions for children, I know there's like a lot of people in like a lot of like, you know, pro-trans spaces, obviously, that like they think when it comes to trans related issues, um obviously like the kids should be able to make the decisions themselves, right? That would be, you know, ideally what they would want. Unfortunately, like we don't live in an ideal world. You know, parents do want to have some level of control of the medical decisions affecting their children. So in situations like that, I think the best possible compromise that you can come to is that the parents are supervising a lot of these treatments, right? Like that's the best compromise you can come to for these things. So that's typically like when you're dealing with states that do permit, you know, the treatment of transgender kids with gender affirming care, that's what's happening. These things are happening under the supervision of the parents or the guardians and the doctor. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. But again, according to like you know Trump and you know some of his supporters and other conservative, you know, commentators, the way they speak about it, they would lead you to believe that kids are just going to school and they're coming back without their parents' knowledge or consent, and they're trans now, and it's just like it doesn't happen that way.
The Constitution.
In a medical sense, it doesn't happen that way. Like you might have a kid who comes out as trans and does like social transition around their friends, but like because they're afraid to come out to their parents, they may not tell their parents about it. So when it comes to social transition, then yeah, it could potentially happen without their parents' knowledge, which I personally don't think there's anything wrong with that. But when it comes to like medical transition, like in states where it's not outlawed, the parents are fully aware of it and they are supervising the treatment. Like that's just how it works. Medical decisions are between the patient, their doctor, and if it's a minor, the parent or guardian. That's it. I did not invite politicians into the doctor's office with me. Yeah, exactly.
So this case was all about the Equal Protection Clause. I think there is a separate case that actually was brought and dropped, but there's a separate issue as to whether or not under the Due Process Clause, parents actually have a liberty interest, a fundamental right to say, we want to do.
So 27 states currently enact laws or policies limiting gender affirming care for minors. So it's all of these states are currently states that have like limitations on gender affirming care for minors. Jeez. Like I knew that there were states that were enacting it, but I got to be honest, this map right here, it's a lot more than I would have anticipated. That's crazy.
Direct our children's medical care. What we know today is that the Supreme Court said that the Equal Protection Clause does not bar these types of laws. We don't have an answer on the Substantive Due Process Clause.
And what kind of consequences are you expecting this decision to have across the country?
Yeah, so across the country, the impact is that there are about 26 laws like Tennessee's laws, which ban gender affirming care for minors. And those laws can now stand. What the court has said is, again, there's no equal protection clause.
That's the significance of this. Even though like the Supreme Court is specifically ruling on like this issue in Tennessee, because of the way that like, legal matters set precedents for like future cases, essentially that's where we stand now. Any state, because of this decision, any state that chooses to ban this stuff, they can legally do that, and it's not deemed like unconstitutional or like a violation of rights or anything like that. It's pretty nuts.
Reason why you can't have.
So you're going to see a lot of families that have trans children and support their trans children and their transition, both in terms of a social level as well as a medical level. You're going to start seeing a lot of those families moving to states that do not have these types of restrictions, which that's a lot. Expecting like your family to uproot their whole lives for something like this, it's a lot. But like a lot of families that do support their trans kids, they do this. It's actually a very common thing.
Have these laws. To be clear, nothing in the opinion says you must have a law like this. It just says there isn't a constitutional bar to do so. And therefore, this is essentially.
So 27 states have enacted laws or policies limiting access. 40% of trans youth live in a state with a limited access policy. I know quite a few trans people that do live in states with restrictions, not even just on kids, but like adults as well. Some states have enacted policies that limit access to gender affirming care to people who are 19. Like if your concern is, underage people, trans youth or like trans kids, why are you limiting access to it to people who are 19 years of age? Like that doesn't really make sense. 17 states are facing lawsuits challenging their laws or policies.
Left to the states to make the determination. There was a lot of language in the court's decision about how the judges want to not second guess state lawmakers, but instead let this be a policy decision for.
Fennec the Rabbit in the chat says, me and my partner may need to have to revisit the conversation of where we want to live. We live in Tennessee. Oh, so you live in the state that's affected by that. Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier in the segment. We live in Tennessee, and while we don't have children, we might have to for the sake of our future children. I mean, yeah, that's fair. I mean, like, even if you have, like, a situation where, like, you have children and, maybe you don't have any trans kids or whatever, it may not affect you in that moment. Just that potential that it might affect you, should you have children and should, your children or one of your children be trans, then yeah, that's a potential risk, and it's something that if you are in support of the rights of trans people, that's definitely something you have to consider for sure. So best of luck to both of you, obviously.
For the states.
All right, Jessica Levinson, thank you.
But yeah, so that's kind of the bad news that the trans community has suffered in regards to this particular issue. Like I know that there's a lot of people who are super divided on like the rights of like access to gender affirming care for like trans youth. It's a very it's a very divisive issue. But I really truly think if people took the time, people who are concerned about it took the time to like educate themselves and learn what does it actually mean to provide gender affirming care for, somebody who's a minor. If they actually took the time to educate themselves on it, I really don't think that they would be all that against it, because it's no different than, several different types of treatment that are provided to, cisgender kids every day. Like we mentioned before, when it comes to precocious puberty blockers are used to treat that even in cisgender kids. When it comes to issues with hormone deficiencies in children, A lot of the same stuff that's used for transgender kids when it comes to hormone therapy, it's used in cisgender kids as well. And nobody really has an issue with those things for the most part. Obviously, in this particular instance in Tennessee, it affects cisgender kids as well in regards to the use of puberty blockers. Um, but for the most part, like, nobody cares about these treatments when it comes to cisgender kids, but suddenly it's an issue when it comes to like transgender kids, and their whole argument falls apart when you really dive into it and when you really start to understand what gender affirming care for minors means, and that it doesn't mean genital mutilation of children. Then you start to realize that a lot of the stuff that conservatives tell you, it's just plain bullshit. But I've had so many people I've talked to privately or publicly about these kinds of issues, and like they're on the fence, or they're on the position of, I don't think that that's appropriate for kids. And then when you actually explain to them what gender affirming care means for kids and for teenagers, then they're like, you know what, that actually doesn't sound so bad. It really changes minds when people take the time to look into this stuff. And I think a lot of people should, even if you happen to stumble upon this video and you're of the position that you disagree with me initially, take the time to look into these things for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Actually look into it for yourself. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of your preconceived notions of what gender affirming care for minors means, you might feel at least a little bit differently about it once you've had the time to look into it. So, just food for thought.